The temperature on the water in Boston Harbor was 35 degrees. There was the beginnings of what would become a rather stiff chill wind throughout the rest of the day. In the darkness of the harbor, a rowboat is making its way across the harbor as silently as it can, because it knows that it has to sneak past the HMS Somerset, Admiral Graves' flagship. The occupants of the boat know that on board the Somerset, as on board every ship blockading Boston Harbor, the Marines are on deck, on watch, with orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave Boston. Now, when I was in school, I was always taught that the American Revolution was about taxes. No taxation without representation, you know the drill as well as I do. But I don't know anyone who risks their lives over taxes. Something else is going on. Something else more important that someone is willing to risk their life over. Like all events, this didn't happen. There are things that happened prior to it, that led up to it. And in this case, it was war. The British Empire spanned the world at this point in time. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And Britain found itself in a series of long and expensive wars, one of which was fought on both the European continent and the American continent. And when these wars were pretty much concluded, the British government discovered they were bankrupt. They needed money to finance their government and their empire. And as they looked around for sources of revenue, they realized that they had one untapped resource: the American colonies, the wealthiest of all of their colonies. And so, Parliament enacted a sugar tax. It was a small tax, and the American colonists accepted it with some grudging acceptance. Mostly the complaints about the tax occurred in the New England colonies because it impacted the rum trade. Now, we normally think of rum as being a Caribbean kind of drink, but in the 1770s, it was the sugar from the Caribbean came to the colonies, they turned it into rum and shipped it back to the Caribbean. Parliament thought they took that pretty well. So they enacted another tax, stamp tax. It was a tax on just legal documents and so forth, very similar, by the way, to what we would now call a notary public. But the response to this tax was pretty much instantaneous and extremely negative. There were protests in the street. Tax agents' homes were oftentimes the center of public rallies opposed to the Stamp Act. Near as anyone could tell, there were very few, if any, stamps sold simply because the agents were afraid to sell them. So Parliament backed down, rescinded the tax, but Parliament decided they had to exert their authority over the colonies, and so they passed a series of other taxes, which collectively became known as the Townshend Acts. Taxes on, another tax on sugar, taxes on imports, taxes on exports, and so forth. And the colonists began to grow increasingly upset at the amount of taxes they were being expected to pay, but not being given any kind of form of input into that taxation. And it began to build up sort of like pressure in a pressure cooker. The king decided he needed to take a firmer hand, and so he replaced the colonial governor in Massachusetts with a military governor by the name of Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage was an honorable man who believed in the rule of law and being ruled by the law, but he was an honorable man in a bad situation. Sort of between a rock and a hard place in a lot of respects. He took his analysis of what was going on in the colonies and what it would take to bring the colonies into submission to the will of Parliament, and he asked Parliament for 20,000 troops. He would need that many to be able to control the colony. Well, politicians are politicians, and they begin to add things up, and they sent him 5,000, not 5 troops. Now, to show you the impact that this had, the population of Boston prior to the arrival of these troops was 6,500. After the arrival of the troops and their officers and the assorted associates and so forth, the population of Boston was 13,000. There was literally one British soldier for every citizen living in Boston. And when you put that kind of stuff together, you get a lot of things beginning to happen, and none of them are any good, culminating ultimately in that snowball fight we refer to as the Boston Massacre. This did not help. This became a rallying point for the colonists. And year after year, they had the remembrance of Boston Massacre. The tipping point came, ironically enough, when Parliament tried to do the colonists a favor. The East India Tea Company had a huge surplus of tea to the point where they are on the verge of almost going bankrupt. So Parliament thought it might make a good conciliatory gesture to these colonists who considered Parliament to be their enemy to sell them this tea at a discount. But we'll add a tax to it. Got to have that tax. And so they added a tea tax. Now, truth be told, the colonists could buy the tea from the East India Tea Company with a discount on the tax and still pay less than what they were paying before. But it was the point. They were taxing us again and not giving us any kind of say whatsoever. And so in the middle of the night, some colonists dressed as Indians climbed aboard the cargo ships and dumped tea into the harbor. The result was the complete destruction of the cargo and a huge financial loss for the East India Tea Company. Parliament said, until the tea is paid for, Boston is locked down. No ships into the harbor until that tea is paid for. Colonists began to really protest at this point, and so Parliament passed what they called the Coercive Acts, meant to force the colonists to submit to the will of Parliament. Colonists referred to them as the Intolerable Acts, because those acts revoked colonial charters, made it so that the colonial legislatures no longer were allowed to operate. If you were charged with a capital crime, you went home to England to be tried rather than being tried by your peers in the colonies. Colonial governors were replaced with royal governors. Troops could be quartered in your home. And if you go down our Bill of Rights, you can see the Intolerable Acts, because each one of those answers one of those things. The colonists began to become very upset, because now not only were they being taxed, their rights as Englishmen were being taken away from them. Gage realized that he had a problem. There was going to be bloodshed. The way to avoid bloodshed is to take away the means of doing it. And so he sent his troops under cover of darkness to the provincial powder house for what he called a powder raid. His troops arrived at the provincial powder house. The sheriff met them, unlocked the door, and they made off with 250 half casks of powder. And the colonists were incensed. They took our powder. Now see, in the 1700s, black powder was very volatile. It's not like the smokeless powder we have today. So if you had any quantity of it, you didn't keep it at home. You stored it in the powder house. If you needed to buy powder, you bought it from the king, from the powder house. So when the soldiers made off with the powder in the powder house, they didn't make off with the king's powder. That had already, in a sense, become, mentally anyway, our powder. They took our powder. That will never happen again. Now, because they could no longer have meetings and official assemblages and so forth, they decided that the best thing to do was to communicate with one another and to do it by committees of safety. I mean, after all, how can you be upset about a committee of safety? Or committees of correspondence. Well, what these committees did was they let everybody know what was going on. And they kept each other informed about things they were doing, things they were preparing for, and so forth. And they began to catch on that there was probably going to be another powder raid. They found out that it was going to happen at Fort William and Mary, which is now up in what we now call Maine, but back then it was still part of Massachusetts. And so, on the day that the troops left by ship to go to Fort William and Mary, the word went out. When the troops arrived at Fort William and Mary, they discovered that it was empty. Colonists had arrived the night before. There had been a token firefight with the regulars who were there, and I have to admit, the regulars who were there were retiring age guys, not quite the best of the British Army. They put up enough resistance to say, well, we tried, and the colonists made off with powder, the muskets, and the cannon. The British troops go home empty-handed. Well, Gage begins to realize, okay, the colonists are starting to watch, and he becomes just a little bit more secretive. If you want to use the word paranoid, I guess that would probably work pretty well. And he decides after a few weeks he's going to try another powder raid on him. This time he's going to be a little more slick about it. So he decides he's going to do a powder raid at the powder house in Salem. Salem is a very congregational town, and so he decides what he's going to do is he's going to do this raid on a Sunday morning when all the good congregationalists will be in church. I can slip in, slip out, and they won't even know what happened. Well, when his troops arrived in Salem on that morning, the entire town of Salem was lining the streets as if to watch a parade, jeering, taunting, and so forth. And when the soldiers arrived at the powder house, they discovered that this is a unique powder house. It doesn't have a door, it has a drawbridge. And the drawbridge is up. We can't get in. And so they have an argument with the people inside. Open the door and everything. No, not going to happen. This goes back and forth, goes back and forth and back and forth. Finally, the local pastor negotiates sort of a truce or an agreement. He asks him, do you have a warrant? Well, yes, we have a warrant. So, tell you what. You can search your warrant. Nothing more, nothing less. You do your warrant, and we'll let you into the powder house. That was agreed to. The warrant said they were allowed to search the forge in the powder house. Now, I don't know why you would keep a forge in a powder house, but that's what they did. So they go and they search the forge and find nothing. Had they searched the entire powder house and so on, they would still have found nothing, because while they were arguing about what was going to happen at the front door with the drawbridge, everything else was going out the back door. So the colonists made off with the powder and the muskets. Gage decided to lay low for a little while, and he developed his own little spy network. And his spy network told him that all of the powder and muskets that had been taken from Fort William and Mary and from Salem were being stored in Concord. And so he begins to devise another plan, because he's gotten a letter from the king. End this. Arrest the ringleaders and end this. Well, what Gage doesn't know is he's not the only one who has spies. I mentioned earlier the committees of correspondence and all of that. Well, if you were to go down the list of all of the members of the committees of correspondence and committees of safeties, you would find two men who appeared on most all of the lists, either singly or both together: Paul Revere and Dr. Joseph Warren. They were the ones who went from committee to committee and kept each other informed and so forth. Paul Revere went one step farther. He developed his own little group of spies that he called the mechanics. These were made up of carpenters, tinkers, coopers, men like himself who were silversmiths, coppersmiths, and so forth. People who could go about their daily business and not be seen. Because, two officers could be talking about something and a carpenter's working on the stairs. Who pays attention to the carpenter? He's just a dumb guy. He's just a carpenter. And so they'll talk. Well, the things the mechanics heard, they told Revere, Revere told Dr. Warren, and they decided what to do about it. Well, they began to pick up that something was going on, but nobody knew exactly what was going on because nobody was really talking. There was just hints of things. And then it happened. Admiral Graves, in the middle of the afternoon, drops his longboats into the harbor. This is unusual. Now, I have to explain something at this point because the military for the British government didn't work then like it does now. Back in 1775, the British Army and the British Navy literally hated each other. It's amazing that they ever were able to operate together. They hated each other. The Navy hated the fact that they had to haul British soldiers around, and British soldiers hated the fact that they had to ride on naval ships. They hated the fact they had to support one another. And in addition to that, Admiral Graves and Thomas Gage personally hated each other. So when Gage, the military governor, sent orders to quietly lower your longboats into the harbor and row them to the far wharf, Admiral Graves dropped them into the harbor in the middle of the afternoon and just plain rowed them to the harbor, or to the wharf. The mechanics picked up. They began to notice troops doing things differently than they normally would do them. So Revere and Warren got together, and Warren decided he needed to use an asset. He had one spy that he could use once and never be able to use that spy again because that spy would be exposed. So he went to the spy, and that spy told him everything. That spy told him where the troops were going, when the troops were going, what their objectives were, and so forth. We do not know who that spy was. Circumstantial evidence would indicate that the spy was most likely none other than Margaret Kimball Gage, General Gage's wife. She was a fifth-generation American. She had obviously been raised in this country. She and her husband were known to engage in rather lively debates about parliamentary sovereignty versus colonial rights. After the events of April 19, 1775, she was sent home to Britain on board a ship loaded with wounded British soldiers. And by many accounts, the two were never seen together until they became. In any event, whoever it was, the colonists now knew what was going on, and they began their own preparations. We know, for example, the one if by land, two if by sea. And I was always taught when I was in school that the reason for that was Paul Revere was waiting on the other side of the harbor, waiting for some sort of signal to know which way to go. Well, the truth of the matter is, Revere was the one helping to hang the lanterns. This was to send the alarm out across the countryside in case he didn't make it. He was the one in the rowboat being rowed across the harbor at the beginning of my story. There was also a rider sent out through Boston Neck, a man by the name of William Dawes. Boston's not in lockdown. Nobody's leaving. Gage is making sure nobody leaves tonight. He's not letting this secret out of his bag. In fact, he's only told 3 people what's going on. Somehow or another, Dawes manages to talk his way past the sentries in Boston Neck. He was a tanner by trade, so most likely they were used to him coming and going, and he kind of looked, man, I got some money on the line here, yada, 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 and they let him go. In any event, Revere gets to the other side. He borrows a horse by the name of Brown Beauty, which is reputed to have been the fastest horse in the colony, and he takes off. He doesn't ride too very far before he runs into some British sentries. Gage has got people out to arrest anyone on the road. He manages to make a backtrack, comes around, he realizes, I may not make it. And so knows he needs to start the alarm himself. And so he starts going through the countryside as he's going along trying to get to Lexington, and he's stopping at particular houses and communities along the way. He was not riding through the streets yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming. That would be like us going downtown Lapeer, running through the streets yelling, the Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. Revere considered himself British. They all considered themselves British. They were British subjects, British citizens. So he simply would stop at a given house, generally where the militia leaders of the town lived, knock on the door. When someone answered the door, he would simply tell them the regulars are out, and the alarm would spread from there. He does eventually make it to Lexington. He arrives in Lexington. He goes to the Reverend Clark's house. At Reverend Clark's house, he rousts Hancock and Adams out of their beds and tells them they need to get out of town because they're part of the whole problem, or the whole objective here. They're going to be arrested. Well, these guys are politicians. Hancock pulls his sword, starts to sharpen it, and says he's going to stand with the militia members. Adams is a little more pragmatic and realizes we need to get out of here. So, being good politicians, they argue about what it is they're going to do. Well, as they're arguing, for about an hour or so, Dawes finally shows up. Dawes and Revere decide what they need to do is they need to continue on down the road and alert Concord. As they're going down the road towards Concord, they run across a man by the name of Samuel Prescott. He's a doctor. Dr. Prescott is on his way home from courting his fiancée, Lydia Mulligan. And in the course of conversation, they discover that Dr. Prescott is a high son of liberty, and he agrees to help them spread the alarm. Well, as the three of them are riding along down towards Concord, they see two sentries under a tree on up ahead. They kind of look at one another, and kind of go, there's three of us, two of them. Pretty much got this, so they keep going. When they get closer, and they see that it's four. And that's a little dicier odds, but there's three of them, four of us, there's four of us, three of them. Yeah, we got this. When they get there, they discover it's actually 8, and they're caught. And they're being led off into a corral, and somehow or another they decide to make a break for it. Dr. Prescott's horse jumps the fence, and Dr. Prescott knows this area very well, so he's off cross country down deer trails and whatnot, and he is gone. Dawes manages to, his horse jumps the fence, and away he goes, and he gets about a quarter mile down the road, loses his balance, falls off his horse, breaks his watch, gets up, looks at the horse, looks at his watch, says, I'm done, I'm going home, and walks back to Boston. Revere never really had a chance. He was caught by the sergeant. They hauled him down off his horse. The sergeant is obviously upset. He's lost 2 people he probably shouldn't have lost. He pulls his pistol, points it at Revere's head, and says, I can't even know your name, sir! Now, this is the age before driver's licenses. There's no electronic communication. If it had been me, I'd have said John Smith. But Revere says, I'm Paul Revere. You will miss your aim. Take a step back. Me. They've just been told to arrest people. They don't know what's going on. We will miss our aim. Revere begins to tell them everything that's going on. There's a column coming out of Boston. They're coming to make some arrests. They're going to Concord, and he spells it all up. And he says, but you're going to miss your aim because I've got 500 militia members waiting on Lexington Green. This is true. We got a problem. And they begin to kind of, oh my gosh, we better warn the column. Wait a minute. Let's check this out. So they start to lead Revere and the other people that they've captured back towards Lexington. And as they're going along, they hear a volley. This massive volley of gunfire. And they think, he's telling the truth! So they cut his stirrups, cut his tack, and leave him and everybody else behind, and they take off because they've got to warn the column. It's a funny thing about night and sounds. Sounds get magnified. You see, what had happened on Lexington Green was the Lexington militia had gathered together after the alarm sounded. They were under the command of Jonathan Parker. Captain Parker was a very sick man, and yet he arrived on the Green with his troops. He has tuberculosis. If you've ever seen the movie Tombstone, Val Kilmer coughing up blood and so forth, that's the stage of tuberculosis that Captain Parker is at. He will be dead by August. But he gathers his men in that cold morning darkness, and he sends out 2 riders to verify that indeed the alarm is true, that troops are on the road. And they go out. One comes back after a short time, says, I haven't seen anything. There's nothing on the road. But the other one doesn't come back, and doesn't come back. And his men begin to get restless, and to be probably honest, chilly. It's cold out. And so Captain Parker says to his men, you may disperse, but do not go farther than the sound of the drum. Now, it's early morning. It's cold. And Buckman Tavern is right there. And it's open. Yeah. What better than a nice warm fire and a nice warm inn and maybe a pint of ale. So they go to the tavern. Well, you don't go into a tavern with a loaded musket. You've got to unload a musket. How do you unload a musket? You set it off. What's more fun than just setting off a loaded musket? Setting off a bunch of loaded muskets all at once. And so that's what they did. And that's the volley that was heard out on the road. Colonel Smith's had a rough day. He is the commanding officer of the British side of this story. He has been given orders to ferry his troops across the cold harbor to a deserted, abandoned stretch of beach on the other side. His men are ferried across the harbor by a very resentful British Navy, who doesn't want to be up in the middle of the night any more than his soldiers do. They take them to the designated part or beach across the harbor, only to discover that it's not really a beach. It's a swamp, and they can't get to the shore. So the soldiers have to get off out of the boats into knee-deep to waist-deep water, 35 degrees, wade ashore, and stand around and wait until everyone is assembled. And then once everyone is assembled, they think, now we're going to be able to get to move. Because you can imagine standing in 35-degree temperatures and wet clothes and boots. Those boots are up to here, and they're full of water. And they're the Uniboot, which is really kind of cool anyway, because they're about as uncomfortable as can be. Only to discover that your commanding officer is a by-the-book British officer. We must arrange our column according to their honors. So he spends another hour or so moving troops around. Finally gets his column in order, and they begin to march. Well, now the soldiers are marching, and their feet are starting to warm up, and they're starting to get their circulation back. And then they come to the creek with a wooden bridge. And Colonel Smith goes, 800 men crossing that bridge is going to make an awful lot of noise and alarm the countryside. We'll wait it. So now they're back into the water, they wade the creek, and they come out the other side, and you can imagine how happy they are at being cold and wet all over again. When they finally get to the town of Monotony, Colonel Smith decides that he is tired. He's a portly, older gentleman, and he decides that he needs to rest for a little bit. But he wants to keep things on track, so he sends his Marines on ahead under the command of Major Pitcairn, John Pitcairn. And the command, or the orders are for them to go on ahead to secure the north and south bridge in Concord. John Pitcairn realizes this needs to be done fairly quickly, so he sends a detachment of about 250 men on ahead under the command of Lieutenant Jesse Adair. Jesse Adair is an Irishman. Not that that really necessarily means anything, other than he is rather stereotypical. He is hot-headed, and he has been known to do things before he thinks about things. As they're getting close to Lexington, someone rides out of the brush, lowers a pistol at him, laughs drunkenly, sets off the pistol. It's a flash in the pan. Doesn't go off. But Adair realizes they're willing to shoot at us, and so he orders his men to load their rifles. So now, contrary to normal British protocol, they are marching with loaded rifles. He is kind of agitated that even a drunk would be willing to take a shot at them. As he arrives, as he's riding along, what he doesn't know is that second rider has arrived back out on the green. And he tells Captain Parker, the regulars are coming. They are right here. They're at the rock. So Parker has his drummers sound the assembly, and his men start pouring out of Buckman Tavern and out of their homes and so forth into assemble. And about the time they're doing that, Adair is coming down onto the fork in the road. Adair has a choice he has to make. He can go to the left and go on into Concord and do as he was ordered to do, or he can go to the right and go down and confront these men which are obviously assembling in defiance of His Majesty's royal troops. Given the previous incident and this incident, Adair decides to break his orders and march down onto the green to confront these rabble-rousers, these rebels, these scoundrels. And as he's coming down onto the green and everything, Captain Parker's men come together, and one of them looks at these professional men gathering down, forming up a battle line, and one of them says, "It is folly for us to stand here." Captain Parker's response is, "Stand your ground. I will shoot the first man who offers to run. Do not molest them unless they us first, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." You need to stop and think about that. This is a small town. He's grown up with a lot of these people. He's related to a lot of these people. He doesn't want to shoot anybody. But it's a testament to his will. They knew he would. And they stood. The British column forms up, begins to march forward in their standard battle formation the way they do, and then begin to shout, "Lay down your arms, you rebels! You damn bulls, lay down your arms!" Parker realizes, okay, we've stood our ground, we've made our point. Turns to his men and he says, gives them the order to disperse. They begin to go back to their homes, go back into Buckman Tavern, wherever it is they were going to go. And a shot rings out. We do not know where the shot came from. Paul Revere, in his deposition on the event, said it sounded to him like a pistol shot. Some people said it sounded to them like it was a pistol shot that came from behind the wall. One deposition said it sounded like it was a pistol shot that came from inside Buckman Tavern, which kind of makes you wonder about everybody following all the rules. In any event, no one knows where that shot came from. However, what happened was the British response was instant. There was a ragged volley. Then there was another ragged volley. Then their professionalism kicked in and there was a full volley. And then came the bayonet charge. The bayonet was actually the British weapon of choice. The rifle was simply meant to confuse, scare, and break up the enemy lines. The bayonet was the real weapon. Jonas Parker had thrown his hat down on the ground and said, "I will never run." He was shot and bayoneted on the green. Jonathan Harrington was shot in the back. Crawled to his front porch just off the green and died in his wife's arms. There were 8 altogether, that died on that green. The troops got their bloodlust up. They went completely crazy. They started breaking into houses and buildings and so forth, and they broke into the meeting house. What they didn't know was that up on the 3rd floor was where Lexington stored their powder. There was a man on the 3rd floor by the name of Ensign Joshua Simmons. Joshua Simmons decided that they were not going to grab his powder. His powder was not going to be a British prize. So he popped the lid off of one of the casks, pulled the hammer back on his musket, and shoved the musket barrel into the cask, and turned and watched the stairs. He could hear them on the 1st floor, rummaging through, ransacking the place, and then he heard them coming up onto the 2nd floor and doing the same. What he didn't know was that at this point in time, Colonel Smith had arrived on the green, and he was appalled at what he saw. these British soldiers running rampant all over everywhere. So he pulled a drummer to himself and had him beat to muster. Now, a British soldier is trained that no matter what you are doing, it is never more important than what the drum tells you to do. So when the soldiers in the meeting house heard the drum beat to muster, they stopped, turned, and left the building. Simmons pulled his barrel out of the cask, and then let off the hammer. He would not have to pay the price to protect his powder that he was willing to pay. Out on the green, Colonel Smith gets his men into order. And then only at that point in time does he decide it's prudent to tell his officers what their orders are, what it is they're trying to do. And his officers tell him, we can't do this. It's clear, the countryside is alarmed. We've shed blood here. We cannot go on. And Smith's response is, I will fill my orders. But he knows his troops have a morale problem right now, so he allows them to fire a victory volley, followed by 3 huzzahs. And then they form up and march to conquer. Imagine that scene. The sound of British troops leaving town. Maybe the sounds of Mrs. Harrington's grief coming over the green. The smell of burnt powder. The shock of a community violated by their king's own troops. In Appleseed, we call this the first strike of the match. Like the old kitchen matches, you strike them and sometimes they spark and sputter, but they don't light. Well, it sparked and sputtered. If this had been all that happened in this day, we probably would look back on this day, on April 19th, as just another day like the Boston Massacre. The sun hasn't quite come up yet. It's going to be a long day. More things will happen. And you'll hear about that later. Thank you.